Welcome back to another four-part series of The Opinion Piece. My name's Andy Stevens. I'm going to be your host for the next four series. And the guest, probably say one of the well-known, worked very closely with government, and we've got a lot in common. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Mark Farmer in. Obviously wrote two reports. One, we were just saying before we started recording, nearly 10 years old, the Modernise or Die, and then Transforming the Construction Workforce, 2023-24. Own personal business, the agency, Cast, stepped down now from the as a CEO, remaining on the board, big global agency, huge success. So what we're going to talk about, leadership and governance, industry image, aging workforce, how to attract youngsters, mental health and wellbeing, and then finally moving the industry forwards. Long introduction, sorry, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for inviting me on.
No problem. Well, let's get straight into leadership and governance. We were talking, this is something we could probably talk about all day. Where we are at the moment is fragmented. It's not accountable. What is your opinion? Because looking back at your Modernise or Die report, collective reluctance or inability to address deep-seated problems. Have you seen any tangible shifts in governance and leadership in the last, 9 years?
It's a tough one to answer, Andy. I would suggest we still have those deep-seated issues. The attempts by various bodies to try and address them have continued and have actually probably stepped up, I would say, in the last decade. The issue is, how do you actually make a tangible difference? And it's fair to say that 10 years on from Modernise or Die, many of the issues that I talked about and I referred to as symptoms of failure are still there. And that's not to blame anyone. It just effectively what it suggests is that all of the effort that's going in to try and resolve issues is not always making the end difference that we would like. So I think where the root of this comes from is the fragmentation of the industry is probably the biggest single thing that we need to overcome. So any attempt by anybody or any governance structure to try and drive change into the industry is always going to go through the filter of huge fragmentation. So when we talk about industry, we're not talking about a thing. It's not an entity. It's thousands of businesses.
Yeah,
and it's that fragmentation which is the biggest thing that we need to solve.
You did put a big point, strategic oversight on the modernisation agenda, and how CLC have got this leadership role. Again, we were talking before we started recording. Voluntary. Is that the better? We've got 3.2 million of us in construction home improvement. We've got a voluntary leadership programme, which, listen, they've got very successful, powerful jobs. They're busy. Do you think we need to look at that? Maybe get this as a paid-for role that's independent and the big word, accountable?
Yeah, it was one of the points I did make in Modernise or Die. It was about the nature of the Construction Leadership Council as being a voluntary body. So everyone on the CLC is donating their time. They all have day jobs, important day jobs. So, it's noble that everyone's volunteering and doing the right thing for the industry, but you do have to sort of think about the reality of how do you get stuff done, which needs more of an executive type function. It needs a fully resourced secretariat sitting behind it that's going to drive action. I think, it was clear over the course of the last decade or so since I made those observations, CLC went through a period where it sort of came together over a very temporary period during the pandemic, when there was a sense of, this is the forum through which it can drive a collective benefit for the industry. It can talk on behalf of industry. But I sense post-pandemic, we've sort of slipped back to a point where all of the sort of structural issues that I referred to in 2016 are still there. That if anything, they're perhaps amplified in a period of stress of the industry. So the industry is, for the last 2 or 3 years, has been going through quite a stressful time of declining output, businesses not having the level of workload that perhaps they were historically used to. So everyone's got a day job to do, which is actually looking after their business. So I think the other key thing that's underlying all of this is it a voice piece for the industry at large? And this is really difficult to square that circle when you've got this massive SME-led tail to the industry, the huge fragmentation that I mentioned. It's really difficult to see how a single body can penetrate down into the deepest parts of the industry where the activity is happening, where it's micro businesses, it's people doing the work, it's people training, it's people, physically in the day-to-day of the industry. That's where it all happens. It's not in all the levels above, even though, that's where the government might see the industry operating at sort of large, big business level. The reality is that's not the case on construction sites. It's about SMEs.
And that's my worry, that governments see construction as the big boys because we haven't got a voice representation. Why do you think that is? Because we're a big if you look at the figures, it's 98% micro SME. And you look at, so we'll talk about it in another episode, the skills board, which has been set up, obviously, to bring more people in. There's no SME representation. We're the heartbeat of the industry.
Yeah, I think, I can't tell you, government's view on the industry. I just think that there's probably a sense that it's easier to talk to fewer, larger representative bodies and businesses in the industry, and clearly the way that the industry structured itself, particularly through the advent over the last 40, 50 years of subcontracting, has meant that the businesses at the top of the hierarchy of contracting, those that contract with government, for instance, those that contract with major developers or investors, are the representative faces of the industry from a simplistic perspective. Yeah. So government will view those names as being the names that are the engine room of the industry. And clearly what's happened is that once upon a time, lots of those businesses did employ lots of all the trades, PAYE, but that's a long time ago. Things have moved on. We now have this huge subcontracting landscape, trade specialisms, and then subcontracting, and then subcontracting, and so on. So the gap between doing the work and those experiencing the construction sites of today and those managing the process and sitting over the top in a very sort of hierarchical level has widened. That gulf has widened. And I think that's the issue, where can certain businesses of certain sizes talk genuinely on behalf of the businesses that are actually doing the work on site? And there's clearly from a CLC perspective, there's been a desire to try and span that divide by engaging some of the federations and the trade bodies that represent the SME sector. But even those have their own challenges in actually representing the wider workforce. No, actually, the number of bodies that are fee-paying members of these SME bodies is only a small slice of the wider SME cohort. So wherever way you look, there's a challenge to penetration. And I think that's the big thing. I'm a big advocate of making sure that when you have leadership bodies, when you have, organisations or working groups or whatever it might be that's set up to resolve a problem, you have the stakeholders that are key to resolving that problem in the room at the table. You can't solve it without the people that you're trying to actually influence. And that's the challenge that I think the industry has. That's the challenge that the Construction Leadership Council has, the challenge that government have in terms of how do you connect with our industry in a way that makes sense. It's the CLC, I think, has been set up for good reason in terms of trying to actually act as a funnel through which government can interact with industry in a user-friendly way. And that effectively, what that does by implication is it just means that the voices at the top potentially lose the connection with the voices at the bottom, because actually government only want to speak with one voice, industry with one voice. So
I think the hardest thing is, because we've got such a big industry, it's so fragmented, is getting the message from the top to everybody. And this is one of the reasons we set this up, is because there's bizarrely, when we did the research, there isn't this globally. Even Southern Hemisphere or North America, having a digital platform, we're very slow to change, as you know, in construction. I think it's too confusing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you ask the average trade, we've got CLC, CIC, we've then got Build UK, we've got all these. Then you look at all the individual sectors, from glazing to roofing, all the federations, bodies, councils. Is it a bit too busy? Does it need streamlining? Because a lot of us don't really know what they do.
Yeah, I think the inference would be that there's too much going on at the moment, and that in itself might be a risk of diluting the effectiveness of a joined up voice, because everyone is clearly, lots of the bodies are membership bodies. You have to pay to be a member, and they only actually represent, as I say, a proportion of the body that they're representing externally, whether that's trades or professions or technical or the industry structure, whether it be tier ones or subcontractors. So I think the fact that we have this huge landscape of different trade bodies and member organisations doesn't always help. Everyone's doing it for good reason. Everyone's trying to actually change things. So you can't deny the thought process around having these bodies to speak on behalf of membership. But the issue is how effectively that's happening. And I do think in large parts of the industry, there's a disconnect between that trade body voice and the reality of the broader sites that you go onto a site, you talk to the guys and girls at the coalface, and you talk about CLC or Build UK or CIC or even the trade bodies that they are sort of tagged to, and there's varying degrees of awareness, if not, in some instances, zero awareness. That's the problem we have. And, it's a really tough one to crack in terms of, how do you get that collective voice? And to get into 2 million plus people in our industry, of which 1 million plus are on sites, construction sites, there is a huge penetration issue that we need around how do we receive feedback as to what's going on? How do we disseminate the feedback back into industry as to what direction is and what people are doing?
They want to hear it, because when we did talks up and down the country, we were on the big sites, small sites, and again, more evidence why we set this up. You go into the canteen or, the smoking area, they're all on their phone. And to me, that's a very easy way of communicating.
Yep.
Love it or loathe it. We consume media differently. Radio's dying. TV's not watched the way it was. People are on these damn things. And if we can communicate and try and get feedback, but the key thing for me is what we do with it. Because if, as you say, there's some, as a trade, we're quite blunt.
Yep.
And just to finish with, I've always said for years, I really want to hear your thoughts on this. How do we communicate? But also, who do we have on this group steering committee? I said we need a broad spectrum of, but we can't just have CEOs of tier ones. We can't just have apprentices. But, for example, tier one CEO, an apprentice electrician, a crane operator, an architect, an engineer. So you've got somebody from all different walks of life, which is obviously tough with such a big industry, but you've got these people that are feeding in going, right, we're losing 50% of apprentices after year one because of this, because I'm sitting in it. Why have we got a shortage of plant operators? Well, we can ask him or her why. Do you think that's an idea? Because to me, it just seems simple.
Yeah, look, I will give you an analogy to that. So I chair a steering group for NHBC, which is looking at the new concept of a site-based multi-skills hub. So basically doing training on sites rather than in FE colleges, and trying to accelerate the learning process of trainees and apprentices into industry, particularly house building. And what we've looked at there is, do we have the volume house builders, the large players dominating that steering group, or do we actually have the trades and the representatives of the individual people that we're trying to train involved? And we've decided, we're still evolving it, to be quite honest, and that sort of reflects the difficulty of trying to get the balance right. But it's clear to me, the anecdotes I hear from the sites, from the workers, from the trades, is the more powerful point of how you learn what you're trying to fix. Yeah. And I think until you learn what you're trying to fix and what the issues are at the coalface, at the workface, you perhaps have a perception or preconceived idea of what the issue is that leads you off in a different direction. And I think for me, it's particularly so the NHBC work, we're working with ground workers, bricklayers, carpenters, and joiners.
Good thing is you'll get told the truth and what they think. And that's a great thing with us lot.
That is evident.
You ask a question, you'll get an answer.
And that's what we need. We need that honesty. We need that honesty. We need a grown-up conversation that things, you can't view it through rose-tinted specs. We've got some big issues that we're trying to resolve. And the reality of what that looks like on the site in a working week for a micro business or an SME is very different perhaps to what some people might think. So that connectivity through to the people doing the work is critical for our industry. We need to really use that as a guiding principle for anything that is actually trying to drive industry improvement and change.
Totally agree. Mark, thank you. Episode 1 done and dusted. Next week, we are looking at something we're going to talk about for a long, long time, I'm sure. Industry image, ageing workforce, and most importantly, how do we get more youngsters into construction?